Hi, and welcome to the Research Room, a space to make research by the people for the people.
Perfect synergy.
And welcome back to another episode of Falsifiable Fridays. Um, Today, I am still talking about empathy, and specifically, I'm going to be talking about what people that avoid empathy. And I mean, that's all of us. We all avoid empathy at least some of the time. So I mean, we all think of empathy as like this good thing. I think it's this very human sort of thing that we do. We try to connect with others. We try to understand others. We try to feel their emotions, and we try to understand their perspectives and things like that. But we all also avoid it. Does that make us less human? No, I don't think so. But we definitely do it, right? Maybe you can even think of your own life and see like times where, I mean, maybe you can sympathize with somebody. Maybe you can try to like just console somebody and support them, or something like that, right? But also, that's not going to be all the time, right? There's plenty of times where, I mean, people are emoting, they are expressing these emotions, and it's just like, I mean, you kind of have to detach. It's hard to always be connected in that kind of way. It takes a lot of your own resources, right? So what I'm going to do is, I mean, I've already kind of said what the point of the paper was, but let me just very explicitly state the finding of this paper. I'll boil it down to one sentence, which is people want to avoid empathy because it's too much work. And so, of course, I'm using slightly different language than what the researchers did, but basically that is what they're saying in this paper for this week. So let's say you heard this finding. Maybe a friend tells you, maybe you read it somewhere, right? That's the headline. What do you do with that? What do you do with that information? How can you actually use it in your life? And what do you do knowing it? What else might you consider knowing this? Do you just believe it on its face? Do you start to question it? What happens? And so I'll briefly say a few more things about the findings in this paper, and then I'll talk about my own questions that I had when reading this. So one of the first things dealt with if you empathize at some earlier point, you're less likely to empathize later. So if you have to see a whole bunch of people that are emoting different emotions, whether that is positive emotions or that could be negative emotions, doesn't matter. If you're seeing that people are doing this over and over and over again, like you have to at some point kind of cut that off. Or maybe you don't have to, right? But people do. People naturally do without any kind of like explanation or reason or anything. People start to do this. Then people think back and they start to think, oh, like I did that because I felt like it was too much effort. I felt like it was kind of actually like frustrating to have to do that over and over and over again. Um, so that's one thing. So if you empathize before, you're less likely to empathize later. Second thing is if we know that we have to empathize for a longer period of time, we are less likely to do it. It kind of goes back to this idea of like resources and energy and time and commitment and just like how much you have to put in to have to empathize. If we know that we're going to be empathizing, I mean, even the difference between like if I can just empathize for a little bit, for maybe 3 seconds, I will choose that over something as small of an increase as 10 seconds. Um, and people very reliably do this. They'll choose the 3 seconds over the 10 seconds. They don't necessarily want more information. They don't necessarily want to continue this like heightened state of empathy. They'll do it. They'll get in. They'll get out. And then the last thing here is that we can change this. So just because we kind of naturally do this doesn't mean that like it has to be this way. We can change the amount that people will choose to empathize. So that can mean that they are more likely or I guess less likely to avoid it is more of the appropriate way to say it, because we already kind of naturally avoid it. So we're less likely to avoid it if we think that we are efficacious. All right. Sorry, I had to stop the recording, but I am back now. So what I was saying was that if we can make people feel more efficacious when it comes to their empathizing, then they are less likely to avoid it. And all that means is that if we can make somebody feel like they are empathizing well, if they know what they're doing, then they're less likely to avoid it. Cool. Okay, so these are some of the general findings from this paper. Um, I have questions though. I have things that I want to further consider before I really know what to do with this finding. And also, I mean, how much do I want to believe it? Um, and or I guess maybe even when should I believe it? When should I not believe it? I don't know if it's ever so easy as like this is completely unbelievable. This is completely believable. It's all kind of context dependent. So, um, first question. The first thing that I consider when thinking about this paper, does any of this mean that empathy is a bad thing? And I think no, I don't think that this is a paper that is really showing that like, hey, empathy is this bad thing. We should be avoiding it. All it's saying is that we do naturally avoid it, and we have reasons for it. We have reasons why we avoid a lot of things, right? Not necessarily because they're bad things. We might avoid things that we know are going to be good for us, just because, like, I mean, we don't want to do it. It's too much effort. Um, we have other things that we want to be doing, whatever, right? And we might even approach things that are not so good for us. Whether or not we're avoiding or approaching doesn't necessarily mean that that thing is good or bad. But it could mean something, right? It could mean that like there is a reason for why we do it. And that reason, I think in this case, I mean, it's at least one reason. Maybe there's other reasons, but one of the reasons is because it is too effortful. We feel like it's too frustrating to have to constantly do this. So we don't, we detach, and that's okay. That's totally okay. But that does not mean that empathy is bad. It also doesn't mean that empathy is good. It doesn't mean anything about that, really. Okay, so second point or second question is does this study mean that we are going to avoid empathy when it comes to friends with family or other close others? And I'm going to say no. I can actually very concretely say no in this case, because that is not what this study is saying. That does not mean that that's not true. Of course we do. Of course we still avoid empathy when it's a close other. But we don't know how often that happens. We don't know when that's most likely to happen. We don't know when people are going to approach empathy in a situation. We don't know answers to those questions necessarily. And I can very confidently say no in this case because the methodology of the study and the article, it doesn't talk about friends. It doesn't talk about family. It doesn't talk about any kind of close other. So there's no way that we can make conclusions about them. We could kind of guess, of course, based off of what we know now, that it might extend to these other people. But the only thing that happened in the study was really that people saw pictures of strangers, and those strangers were showing emotions. They could be positive emotions. They could have been happy. They could have been more negative emotions, like maybe they were angry or maybe they were sad. Um, we, as participants in the study, we ended up, or they ended up, I wasn't in the study, they ended up trying to empathize with these strangers. And so I think knowing that information, of course, people are not empathizing all the time. Like, why would they? Why should they? There's no benefit. There is no consequence. It's literally just like, do you want to or not? And if you're just randomly sitting in a room looking at your computer screen, why would you actively choose to empathize just all the time? If you have picture after picture after picture, eventually you're kind of gonna like detach from that process. So I will also very strongly say that I think, like I could be wrong, of course, But I do think if these were pictures of friends, if these were pictures of family members, if this was a picture of like your romantic partner in different situations, you are probably going to empathize at least a little bit more. You're probably also going to avoid it sometimes. So, right. But like the amount that people avoid it in this current study, I think it is a lot more than what it would be if it was a close other. So we have to keep that in mind when we're thinking about this, is that this study and the findings, they really only apply to pictures of people we don't know. Pictures are very different than, I mean, even if these were videos, right? If we were asked to have to empathize with that, if these were people right in front of us, even if they were strangers, that would probably change this finding as well, at least a little bit. Maybe the general conclusion might be the same, that we do still, we stop empathizing because at some point it is too much effort. But yeah, I mean, there's so many things to consider on how this could change. So yeah, I just wanted to bring that up. Um, Another thing is that when it comes to increasing empathy, I mean, I have said now that if you increase your efficacy, if you think that you can empathize better, then you're more likely to empathize. You're less likely to avoid empathy at the very least. So, is that is that to say that that's the only way to do this, right? Can you increase empathy in any other way? Can you decrease avoidance of empathy in any other way? Yes, of course, totally, right? I would not say that this is the only way. This is just the only way that the researchers were able to like incorporate into their study. There's so many other ways that you could potentially increase empathy. If you, I mean, the simple things, right? Things that I've already kind of mentioned. If you know the person, that's probably going to increase empathy. That's going to decrease your avoidance of it. Of course, that also depends, right? Like there are certain people that you know that you're probably going to very actively avoid empathy, and that's okay. That's totally okay, right? You do not have to empathize with everybody. You don't have to empathize with anybody at any point. If you want to, you can, but you do not have to. So knowing somebody also simply will not either increase or decrease. That's also going to be dependent on other factors. Do you like the person? Are you close to that person? Things like that, right? Are you willing to do it if you are going to get something in return from that person? And not to like make people sound like they are just like out to like use everybody else. Of course, that's not the case. But like, I mean, whether consciously or not, there's a lot of times where we're making these connections because we think that like, I mean, if I make this friend, like, yes, sure, that feels good, but also if I have this friend, I potentially have support in the future, and I'm going to get something from this relationship, right? Like, you're not just here to make friends and like that's kind of it. Some of the time, at least, there's plenty of times where like, I mean, we make these connections because it's beneficial to our lives in some sort of way, and that's okay as well, right? So if we know that we're going to get something from somebody, are we less likely to avoid empathy? I think probably, right? Maybe even just the more that you know about a person, whether you're close or not, if you simply know more details about their lives, if you know their background, if you know things about the way that they grew up, if you knew things about like the town that they lived in, if you knew things about the kind of job that they have and like whatever, right? Like all these other things that make a human. If we know these kinds of details, I think we're probably also more likely to empathize with them. Um, I of course have a lot to say on that on that point, but that would be not necessarily founded in research, and also um, I would keep going on and on about it. So I'm going to stop that. But I think you understand, right? That like if you know somebody, somebody's life, if you can understand their humanity, you're more likely to empathize with them. You're more likely to at least want to try to empathize with them. Maybe you don't successfully do it. That's also okay. But maybe you at least try. Cool. Okay. So I don't need to walk away from this finding or this video thinking that that's the only way to increase empathy. There's plenty of other ways. And in general, like we don't we don't see anything about like the social motivations here when it comes to empathy. That would be a whole other set of studies that would need to be done before we can start to think about that. Okay, so then last thing that I'm going to bring up is this idea of how often are we actually avoiding empathy, or how often are we empathizing? So let's say we had 100 chances to empathize. Out of that 100, we might do it about 35 of those times. That's just the average that happened across the 11 studies that occurred here. So they did this study 11 times over. And in that, I mean, there's even variation on what the average is. In one study, it might have been 25%. In another study, it might have been 30%. In another study, it might have been 35%. In another study, it might have been 40%, so on and so forth, right? We see that depending on who is in the study, it's going to change. And so there's no reason that you wouldn't also make the conclusion that depending on the individual, this number is also going to change. We don't need to be so tied to this idea of 35% or 35 out of 100 times. All we have to know is that more often than not, people are going to avoid it. And that was a very clear finding that happened over and over and over again. It's not like it was like 50% or 60% or 70%. It's fairly different from those numbers. So when it comes to this, I guess I just want you to remember that this is research. These are averages. There's going to be a range. There literally has to be like a range, basically. If you're going to be talking about averages, there's going to be people below that average, there's going to be people above that average, and so just keep that in mind. So maybe you hear this finding and you're like, oh, I completely agree with that. Like I know that I avoid empathy, right? And maybe even start to think in your own life, like, oh, like people tell me their emotions all the time. I'm not necessarily empathizing with them. I might like talk to them. I might communicate with them or interact with them or whatever, but I'm not necessarily empathizing with them, and that's okay. Maybe on the other side, where it's like I don't necessarily agree with this. Like I know in my own life that I empathize at least 50% of the time or whatever. I know, or maybe if it's a close other, like I am 100% empathizing with people. Great. If that works for you, then great. And that's also okay. This is not meant to describe every single person. This is just meant to say, what can we kind of expect when it comes to this? And even if those numbers aren't completely accurate, that's okay. We still have a lot of good ideas here that, and I would say this kind of applies to anybody. Everyone has a limit. And so at some point, once we reach that limit, we start to think, hey, this is too much effort. This is too much energy. This is too much of my own resources and my time. And I can't keep empathizing with everyone. There's good things about that. It's good to recognize that, like, hey, I'm feeling like worn out or burnt out from empathizing all the time. And then there's like the like sort of negative part of like having to empathize all the time, which is sometimes you become like this like cold, cynical person, and you don't want to do it anymore. And that's also completely natural. We bounce around in this, even if you are generally an empathic person. You're allowed to not be. In any given instance, you're allowed to not be. So yeah, just keep this all in mind as you hear these kinds of findings. There's so many things that we have to also consider. No one study can do it all. And so if you do want more information on this, I have more information on this, and you can find that information on my website, which is roomforresearch.com. You can also find this on social media, which is at Room for Research. So Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, all those. You can find more information there. And so with that, I'm going to end this episode. For next week, I am going to be talking about more empathy, of course. And in this case, I'm going to be talking about the times where empathy, it doesn't actually lead to more caring and compassion. Like we think that is the natural kind of consequence of empathy. It does not always work that way. So I want to explore that idea. And so I'll do that next week. And so I guess, yeah, until then, thank you. Thank you for your time. I'll talk to you all next week. Yeah.
with the sun will breathe. Perfect sense.